A farmer in rural Egypt was digging in his field when his shovel hit something that wasn't a rock. 3 feet down, solid, shaped, intentional. What he had found was a clay jar. Inside it was a bird, wrapped in linen, dead for roughly 2,500 years. And underneath his field were 155 more. But here's the part that matters. Those animals told researchers which god the temple belonged to and where its walls stood before anyone had found a single stone of it. Because there was no temple. Not on the surface, not on any map, not in any record that survives. The building those animals were buried beneath had been erased so completely that until that shovel came down, nobody knew it had ever existed. The bodies were the only witnesses left. This is how they were read. It started on an ordinary morning in the Sohag governorate, about 300 miles south of Cairo. The farmer, call him Ahmed, because the family asked not to be named, and discoveries like this bring the kind of attention nobody wants, had worked that field his whole life. His father worked it. His grandfather worked it. They knew every inch of it. And they knew about the patch. There was a section, maybe 40 feet across, where the soil ran darker than the ground around it. It dried faster after rain. Nobody had ever thought much about it. It was just how that corner was. Then came the season the crops in that corner came up wrong, thin, stunted, failing, while everything around them grew fine. So he went looking for the reason. Something in the soil, maybe. Something buried that shouldn't be. 3 feet down, the shovel stopped. He called his neighbors. His neighbors called the local antiquities inspector. And within a week, an excavation team was standing in a farmer's field, looking at the top of a clay vessel that had not seen daylight since the reign of the pharaohs. The first thing the team had to do was find out how many were down there. That took 3 weeks, because they hadn't found a pit. They'd found a chamber, cut, lined, deliberate. And by the second day, it was already obvious that the number wasn't going to be the interesting part. The arrangement was the final tally: 23 ibises, 47 cats, 31 dogs, 9 gazelles, and 46 others. Small mammals, birds, a handful of species still being confirmed. 156 animals, every one of them prepared by hand. Everyone placed on purpose. The team mapped the chamber before they emptied it. And when they stepped back and looked at the map, the shape of it was unmistakable. The ibises and the cats were in the center. Everything else, the dogs, the gazelles, the smaller creatures, sat in rings around them. Concentric, ordered. The valuable offerings at the heart, the lesser offerings radiating outward. That is not how you fill a pit. That's how you fill a room that has a focal point. Sacred at the center. Common at the edges. It's the logic of a sanctuary. The geometry of a building where one spot in the floor plan is holier than the rest, and everything else arranged in relation to it. Which raised the obvious problem. There was no building, just soil, and a farmer's crops, and 156 animals lying in careful orbit around a center that had nothing standing in it. The bodies were laid out around something that wasn't there anymore. So the team did something with that. If those rings really were following a floor plan, then the plan was still recoverable, because the animals were sitting inside it. They took the axis of the innermost cluster, extended it out through the rings, and marked on the survey map where the walls of a building that size would have to run. 2 lines, drawn on a map of an empty field, on the strength of nothing but where 156 corpses had been placed. Hold on to those lines. We're coming back to them. The second thing came from the wrappings. The ibises had been treated with natron salt, prepared one way, and bound in a linen wrap specific to birds. Long body, folded neck, the beak tucked and secured. The cats were done differently. Different drying, different binding, the limbs drawn in tight against the body. The dogs, different again. This is the detail that does the heavy lifting, so it's worth being clear about what it means. If one man had been mummifying everything down there would look the same. It doesn't. Each species was handled by someone who knew that species required its own method, its own salt, its own timing, its own wrap. That's not a talent, that's a training. Somebody taught somebody else, and that person taught the next one, and the techniques got refined across working lifetimes. Which means this wasn't an event, it was an occupation. You don't get specialist priests without a place for them to be specialists in. Somewhere near this field, there had been a permanent religious institution with a permanent staff, running long enough to pass its craft down through generations. 2,500 years later, the only surviving proof of that institution was the way the linen was folded, and then the team noticed the thing that wasn't in the chamber. No falcons. In 156 animals, offered over what looks like decades, there was not one falcon. And the falcon was sacred to Horus, one of the most widely worshipped gods in all of Egypt, honored at temples the length of the Nile. No crocodiles either. Sohag, absent. No serpents. Nothing for Ra. Now, an absence can be an accident. One missing species is noise. But 3 of the most common sacred animals in Egyptian religious practice, all missing, from a collection this size, while ibises and cats dominate the center of the floor, that's not noise. That's a policy. The ibis belonged to Thoth, god of writing, of wisdom, of record keeping. The cat belonged to Bastet, protection, fertility, the household. And the animals that belonged to everybody else weren't allowed in. A worshipper who walked to this temple with a falcon would have been turned away. Whatever stood in that field wasn't a general-purpose sanctuary where any god could be honored. It was dedicated, narrow, specific. The team had identified who the temple was, for without having found one stone of the temple itself. The congregation had named their god by what they carried through the door and by what they left at home. Then, the isotope results came back, and the site got bigger. Isotope analysis reads the chemical signature that water and food leave in bone. It tells you, in broad terms, where an animal lived. Not a street address, but a region. The cats came back local, nearly all of them. Born nearby, raised nearby, offered nearby. Neighborhood animals. The ibises did not. A significant share of the birds carried signatures pointing to wetlands hundreds of kilometers from that field. They had been raised somewhere else entirely and brought to this specific patch of ground to be given to this specific god. 2 ways that happens. Either the temple was buying sacred birds through a supply network that reached across the country, or people were carrying them here themselves from a long way off on purpose. Either version means the same thing. This place had a reputation. It pulled from far outside its own valley, and a temple that pulls pilgrims from hundreds of kilometers away is not a village shrine. So here is what the animals had established before anyone brought a single instrument onto that field. A permanent religious institution stood on this ground. It employed trained specialists who passed their craft down through generations. It was dedicated to Thoth and Bastet, and it turned away offerings to other gods. It was known well enough, far enough away, that sacred birds traveled hundreds of kilometers to reach it. And its walls ran along 2 lines on a survey map. That is a significant building. And there is no record of it, not in any surviving king list, temple register, priestly record, or administrative document. Not one line. A place that important should have left a paper trail 2,500 years long. It left 156 bodies and nothing else. Then they brought in the ground-penetrating radar. Under about 2 meters of sediment, the survey picked up stone. Foundations. A large open space consistent with an offering hall. Cut lines crossing one another where the building had been expanded and repaired over the better part of a century. And the foundation walls ran where the team had said they would run, not approximately. On the marks. The rings of animals had been following that floor plan the whole time, holding the shape of the building long after the building stopped existing, because the priests laid every jar in relation to a sanctuary that was standing right above their heads. As for where the stone went, it was taken. Cut blocks were the most valuable building material in the ancient world. and a disused temple was a quarry that came pre-cut. Block by block, over years, the walls were carried off to become somebody else's wall, somebody else's foundation, somebody else's newer and more fashionable temple a few miles down the road. But nobody touched the chamber underneath. Sacred animals had no resale value, and disturbing them carried a cost nobody was willing to pay. So the field closed over the top. Loose rubble and disturbed fill where the chamber was. Packed earth everywhere else. Ground like that drains faster than the soil around it. It dries quicker after rain. It runs a shade darker. And roots that go down 3 feet hit stone. That patch of bad ground the family had farmed around for 3 generations was the temple. They'd been looking at it the whole time. There's one more thing. Among the inscriptions on the jars, most of what's legible is procedural, species, date, the god it was meant for. But on one of them, there's a name. Not a king, not a priest, a private individual. The person who paid for that animal to be prepared and offered, recorded on the vessel the way a donor's name goes on a plaque. That name appears nowhere else. Not in any other inscription from the region, not in any administrative record, not in any list of officials or landholders or families. Scholars have looked. There is no second reference. So think about what that means. Someone walked to this temple. They had a reason, something they wanted or feared or had lost. They paid for a bird to be prepared properly by trained hands, and they had their name cut into the clay so the god would know who it came from. Then they walked home and lived the rest of their life and died, and every other trace of them is gone. No tomb, no mention, no descendants who wrote anything down that survived. The civilization they belonged to was studied for 2 centuries by people who never once encountered their name. 1 jar in a chamber under a field. That's the entire surviving evidence that they existed.